This is the case of Chloe Davis from 1940. Please note that there is a trigger warning on it. The pictures are not graphic, but the narration can be. Please also visit the narrator, Gabby, by visiting the link in the description box, especially if you like the older true crime cases. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
And I think one of the main reasons that I had never heard of it is because there's really not a lot of sources out there covering this story, which is extremely surprising because I have never really come across a story quite like this one. So with all that being said, let's just get right into it. Before I get into this case though, I do have to give a warning that this video features graphic details of a crime scene that does involve children, the topic of self-harm and suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. This case is extremely heavy, it's extremely tragic, and even after I did all of the research for it, I still was very hesitant to even film because it does involve the subject of mental health, and when you cover the subject of mental health in general, sometimes there's no way to say the exact right thing because everybody has their own opinions when it comes to it. But I tried to dive into this case and just cover all of the details and go over the story for what it is. This story though revolves around a family tragedy, and due to it revolving around a family tragedy, I'm going to go into a little bit of a backstory about the mother and the father first. The mother was Lolita Dahl Bjorkman, pictured here with her daughter Chloe. She was born on September 13th of the year 1903 to parents John Gustav Bjorkman and Louise Bell McCready Bjorkman in Chicago, Illinois. From my research, her father came all the way from Sweden, and her mother was from Grand Rapids, Michigan. The father was Frank Barton Davis, most called him Barton. That's kind of what I'll be calling him for the remainder of this video. He was born on October 3rd of 1898 to parents Frank Frisbee Davis and Mary Alice Marquis Davis in Concordia, Kansas. Although Lolita and Barton had been born in different states, they both grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which was where Lolita's mother was originally from. Lolita and Barton, they had met, fell in love, and they married on Christmas Day of the year 1926 when she was 23 years old and he was 28 years old. During the year of 1925, Barton was actually living in Los Angeles, California, but was so head over heels for Lolita that he had gone back to Michigan to marry her, and they started discussing future plans together after they tied the knot. They had been spending a bit of time apart at this time due to his job, but they were trying to figure out where to finally settle down to start a family. For the next few years, they would move back and forth between Grand Rapids and Los Angeles, ultimately moving completely to Los Angeles. They would welcome 4 children into this world. The first one being Chloe Dibble Davis, who this story mostly focuses on, who was born on September 4th of 1928. The next child would be Chloe's younger sister, Daphne Dell Davis, who was born on January 10th of 1930. The third child would be Chloe's second younger sister, Deborah Ann Davis, who was born on July 1st of 1933. The fourth and last child would be Chloe's little brother, Barton Marquis Davis, who they called Mark, who was born on March 7th of 1937. By the year 1940, the family had become settled in Los Angeles, living at West 58th Place. Their home was only a 2-bedroom though, so the parents had 1 bedroom and the 4 children shared the 2nd bedroom. Barton worked at a local grocery store. He was the manager of the grocery store, and his wife, Lolita, was a stay-at-home mom. While her husband was at work for the day, she would take care of the children, clean the house, and cook. From the outside, the family truly seemed like a normal family. You wouldn't have expected any of them to have anything dark lingering in their minds. You wouldn't expect them to soon be on the front page of every local newspaper that was covering a gruesome quadruple murder case. The family attended church, and overall it seemed like Lolita and Barton tried their hardest to instill good values in their young children. One of those values would be respecting their elders and doing what they were told. This characteristic, though, of obedience would play a huge part in this case, leaving people with the question, is it always a good thing to do exactly what your parents tell you to do? Lolita seemed like a caring and compassionate mother who, although she kept busy, she had time to read. She read a lot. Some of those books she would indulge in were parenting books. Actually, pretty much most of the books that she read were parenting books, all about how to be the best parent you could possibly be. Two of the books that would be found in her collection would be under the titles How to Be a Good Mother and How to Raise Your Children. Lolita, though, would have recently picked up another book that possibly led to pushing her over the edge. But we'll get to that later. Now we're going back to the day of April 4th. After Barton arrived home on April 4th of 1940, he gets out of the car and sees his 11-year-old daughter, Chloe, sitting on the porch outside their family home. She is showing no emotion, no happiness, no sadness. She was simply stoic and tells her father words he will never forget. Those words being, I think you better go in the kitchen and see. Barton had left his home for work that morning at 7 a.m. and when he left, the home was in its normal state and his wife was in bed. He had kissed his wife goodbye and hoped to see her and their children hours later when he would get home from work. That wouldn't be the case though. The front door was locked, which was odd because Chloe had been outside. He doesn't question it at first. He just unlocks the door and goes inside. The first room he goes to is the kitchen, like his daughter told him to. Upon stepping closer to the kitchen, he sees the body of his 3-year-old son, Mark, right in the doorway, lying in a pool of his own blood. Barton would then see his 6-year-old daughter, Deborah, lying behind his son, also in a pool of her own blood. He would go on to find his wife's partially burned body on a mattress on the floor in the hallway and his 10-year-old daughter, Daphne, in the bathtub, also dead. Chloe, at this time, she is still showing no emotion. Her father, though, his world just came crashing down. He flies out of the home screaming and crying on the front lawn. He's gasping for air. He can't hold back his tears, saying how he has nothing in the world left to live for. Chloe, though, she offers him some eerie words of advice and says, brace yourself up, Daddy. You mustn't get excited. Come on, let's go for a little walk. Barton, he couldn't think clearly at this time, obviously, so it would be a neighbor who would call the police. The same neighbor who let Chloe use their phone to phone her father at work earlier. All 4 individuals left in the home would be officially pronounced dead after inspecting their remains to see if there was any pulse left. There would be 2 main people who would question Chloe about what actually happened that fateful morning. The first being LAPD homicide captain Edgar Edwards, and the second was police psychiatrist Dr. Paul DeRiver, who I have to mention at the time was a very well-respected psychiatrist who had worked on many cases before. Both of them would question the 6th grader, the only living person from that tragedy, the only person they could ask about what happened that morning after Barton left for work. At first, Chloe wasn't really saying much. She would tell them, though, you can't make me confess I didn't do it. Other than her wounded head, though, it was noticeable that the palms of her hands seemed to have some wear to them. They were a bit blistered and bruised. This is something Captain Edwards would immediately take note of. What Chloe would go on to tell them, though, which she did change her story around a little bit at times, and at first simply kept saying she didn't commit any of the murders, but as questioning went on, she started giving up more information until supposedly telling her full story. The overall conclusion she had for what happened, though, was that her mother had lost her mind, believed that demons were after her and her children, and that morning wanted to take her children's lives and her own. Chloe sat calm with a bandage around her head as she recalled what she said happened that morning. The account I will be going over is her final account of what happened that day, since she had changed her story a tiny bit from time to time. According to Chloe, her 3 siblings had awoken before her. They let her sleep longer, and she awoke to the sounds of screaming and hammering. The screams were from her two younger sisters, Daphne and Deborah. Chloe says she got out of bed as fast as she could to find her mother, half naked, barely covered up by her nightgown, running around the home with a hammer, screaming and going back to bash the hammer into her children's heads some more and saying they needed to die so the demons don't get them. Lolita swings the hammer at Chloe, but Chloe quickly moves out of the way. The hammer only slightly grazes Chloe's head, which is apparently how she got the scalp wound. And then Lolita continues her tirade. Chloe said that after Daphne and Deborah took their last breath, her mother asked her to help her move the mattress to the hallway, so she helped her do that. After that, Lolita asks Chloe to please hit her with the hammer in her head repeatedly to take her life as well. Chloe asks her why, and Lolita told her that demons were after her because she killed her cousin with her strange powers. This was a cousin of theirs who had supposedly died from what was said to be natural causes. Lolita supposedly said that these demons were after all of them, and that's why she had to kill herself and her children to escape these demons. Then, supposedly, Lolita grabs some matches and tries to light Chloe on fire, but Chloe quickly puts the flames out because she doesn't want her blonde hair to catch fire. Lolita then lies down on the mattress and asks her to set her on fire. Chloe continues to do what her mother tells her to do. Lolita's hair and nightgown start burning a little bit, and she continues to ask her oldest daughter to beat her with a hammer in the head for it all to be completely over with. Lolita tells Chloe that after she is dead, that she wants Chloe to run away and never come back because people are going to think that she did it. Chloe says that at this point she paused, she didn't want to hurt her mother, and then she does what her mother tells her and she starts hitting her mother's head with the hammer. Then Chloe sits back, I guess she's feeling a little winded, and her mother is still alive at this point. She decides to go grab a glass of water. She went to the bathroom to get the water, and at this time she sees her sister in the bathtub dead. Then she goes back to her mother with this water and she drinks a little bit and then tries to give her mother some of the water and pours it down her mother's throat, thinking that her mother is possibly also thirsty. Then she continues the hammering a few more times. She gets tired, tries to go into her room to rest, but her mother is still begging her to continue until she is fully dead. And this is one of the hardest parts to go over, but at this time, little Mark in the kitchen had his skull nearly cracked open, but he is whimpering. Chloe asks her mother if she should take the hammer to his head to make him stop, to put him out of his misery. Lolita agrees this would be the best idea, so Chloe does just that. She did what her mother told her to do. While in the kitchen, she had looked at the clock and it was about 7:45 a.m. After her brother took his last breath, she continues the hammering to her mother's head, but the head of the hammer was becoming loose on the handle. She tries to look for another hammer, finds one, but it's a small medical type hammer a doctor would use to check for your reflexes. She puts that back down and decides to just use the loose hammer instead. Eventually, her mother is dead. I do have to mention that in Chloe's first account of what happened, she claimed that Mark was already dead. Then she changed it to him still being alive and to her being the one to finally end his life. Chloe stated that she had hit her mother in the head around 50 times. You are probably wondering how on earth her mother had not died sooner though. Well, it was said that the mother's head had been on a pillow on the mattress, so her head was kind of just bouncing on the mattress, and the hammering was not creating as much damage as it would be if her head was directly, say, on the floor. I don't know how that sounds, but that's supposedly what the experts say. Chloe says that after they were all dead, she decided to clean herself up a little bit. She changed her clothes, washed her body of any blood, and left the home. They asked her why she locked the front door, and she says, because I was afraid somebody would walk in. First, I was going to telephone Daddy from the drugstore, but then I remembered I didn't have a nickel. Then I was going to mooch a nickel, but I decided not to. I decided to go to Mrs. Randolph's house instead. She said that after she used the Randolph's phone and Mrs. Randolph heard her on the phone telling her father to come home immediately, of course Mrs. Randolph was concerned, and Chloe tells her, everything's okay. I won't say anything till Daddy gets here. But then Chloe, a moment later, says, it's something so terrible You'll probably read all about it in the newspapers. Chloe says, "When Daddy got home, I said he'd better go into the house. I heard him in there saying, 'Oh God,' and all that kind of stuff. Then he came out and said he and I were alone in the world now. So I told Daddy to control himself and calm down." The investigators asked Chloe about her mother, and Chloe says, "Sure, Mama was always kind to us. She was never mean. I guess she loved us all right. I loved her, but I didn't cry. I never cry." After questioning Chloe, Dr. DeRiver had a lot of opinions about the 11-year-old. To start it off, he believed, and would convince Captain Edwards of this, that Chloe was the one responsible for everything, not her mother. He would say that Chloe acted very mature for her age, that while talking to her, she sounded more like a 15 or 16-year-old rather than an 11-year-old. It was obvious that both Dr. DeRiver and Captain Edwards were a bit shaken by the child, mostly because during questioning, she was just so nonchalant. She talked about that day in the same manner someone would talk to you about what they did in school. She really didn't show any emotion. She didn't cry once. One thing about Chloe that I do have to mention that was documented is that she did have a bit of a temper. One report stated that a neighbor had come forward after the incident and was quoted saying, "Chloe had once grabbed her mother by the hair and knocked her head against a concrete wall because she refused to give her a nickel for ice cream." Both Dr. DeRiver and Captain Edwards believed that Chloe was an evil one, that she had woke up that morning, killed her 3 younger siblings with the hammer, then overpowered her mother, and that since her mother was a frail woman with anemia, it wasn't hard for her to do so. Chloe was not even 5 feet tall at the time, but she was an athletic child, and they believed she would have had the strength to commit such a heinous crime. They believed Chloe, after killing them all, dragged the mattress out, put her mother on it, and attempted to burn the house down, starting with her mother's body. And when that didn't work, she decided to clean herself up, sit for about an hour or so, and figure out what she needed to do next. That Chloe sat there and made up the entire story about her mother believing that demons were after her family and that she needed everyone to die because of it. That she had her story down and then went over to the neighbor's home and asked to call her father to tell him to come home from work immediately. This is what the 2 men truly believed at the time. It was mostly Dr. DeRiver who believed this, and then he kind of got in Captain Edwards' head, and then Captain Edwards believed it. Dr. DeRiver was confused about the possible motive behind why she may have done what she did. But he stated she may have had a hereditary mania that had been passed down from her mother, and that she may have had an Electra complex. Basically meaning that Chloe was jealous of the attention her mother and other siblings received from her father, and that she wanted to be the only person left in his life to love. The Electra complex was a theory developed in 1913 by Carl Jung, and it usually involves a young girl between the ages of 3 to 6. It's a term they use to describe an attraction a young girl has to her father, and during this time, they may become very malicious to their mothers or anyone else who receives any of their father's attention. It is comparable to the Oedipus complex in males. Although Chloe was not between the ages of 3 to 6, Dr. DeRiver believed this may be what she was mentally going through and her reasoning for slaughtering her family while her father was at work. Dr. DeRiver would speak to a reporter soon after his questioning of Chloe, and he would be quoted saying, "Chloe is a very precocious youngster. She is old beyond her years, headstrong and very opinionated. We know that she was at least part party to the slayings. We know that acts of this kind are committed by people who lack feeling and are sadistically inclined. She is very cold, lacks remorse, and either forgets easily or tragedy makes no impression on her." The normal individual, particularly a child who knew right from wrong and who had apparently a close bond of affection for her mother, even when ordered by that mother to do what Chloe says she was ordered to do, would have refused and gone for help. A child would not have to be particularly bright to realize that what the mother assertedly ordered Chloe to do was not the right thing to do. The unnatural way she rested between times while beating her mother, the cold-blooded manner in which she got a second hammer after the first one broke, the cold-blooded manner in which she telephoned her father and didn't even tell him what happened, all these tendencies and all these discrepancies need clarifying. This is what Captain Edwards and his homicide investigators are attempting to do. The child is being handled very carefully. No third-degree methods are being used. An attempt is only being made to learn the true and the complete story of what happened in that house. Well, an autopsy would be done of Lolita Davis, and the results astounded everyone. The cause of death was listed as blood loss. Not from a hammer, though, but from cuts to her wrists. At first, Chloe had said nothing about her mother grabbing a razor. But after the cause of death was released and they asked her about it, she said she had forgot about it before, but that she remembers her mother did grab a razor and start harming herself. The first day of questioning, they had questioned Chloe about 12 hours. She was booked on suspicion of murder by policewoman Rose Pickerel, and she was sent to a juvenile hall. That night before bed, she was feeling a bit hungry, and she asked for 2 things for dinner. One was a steak, the second, a beer. They brought Chloe a steak, and when she didn't get her beer, she was not too happy, apparently. She went on to say that her mother had split one with her only a few days before, and that she wanted one. During the entire questioning of Chloe, her father Barton cried for his daughter, and you have to think that this was the only person in his family that he had left, and he clung to her. He did not believe for a second that the events of the day panned out like Dr. DeRiver and Captain Edwards claimed they did. He begged for them to stop looking at his daughter as a criminal, that she was just as innocent as his other children, and that poor Chloe only did what her mother told her to do. The day after most of her questioning was done, she was taken back to the family home to go over the scene there and tell them step by step what happened. When Chloe arrived at her home and she's walking up to her front door, there are people surrounding the home, just people in the neighborhood and some children that she had been friends with. And she's kind of just waving to her friends, and they're standing there in disbelief because they know what had happened. And it's almost like she just had no idea the intensity of the situation, which of course she was 11 years old, but she just was waving to them like nothing had happened. Which I just have to say that I personally don't agree with a lot of the parents in the neighborhood letting their children, surround the house and watch her walk up to the door. Chloe walked into the home that still had its walls splattered with blood and carried her doll under her arm as investigators listened to her tell her story. This would be the same story that she told before. While going through the house, she still did not really show any emotion and just pointed out little things in her room and made sure to tell them that she loved books and that she was quite a bookworm. It was all very strange to them. People did not know what to think of her behavior, whether she was just this cold-hearted little girl, whether she just didn't grasp the intensity of what happened because she was so young, or whether something had just broke in her head due to the trauma of what happened that day of the murders. They would question her, and she would just sit there munching on some candy, answering their questions like she didn't have much of a care in the world. And Captain Edwards would go on to tell the press that they couldn't break her story, that they were going to keep questioning her until they know that they have the truth. Dr. DeRiver was adamant that this little girl was completely capable of planning and going through with all 4 murders. He was positive of it. By April 6th, though, only 2 days after the murders, Barton Davis was adamant about something himself, and that was that his daughter was not guilty, and that he was going to do everything he could to get her out of the juvenile facility. Now, this is where things start to flip. Chloe had been saying that the reason her mother wanted the children dead was because she believed demons were after her and her children. At first, when questioned about this, Barton would say that he never heard his wife ever say such a thing, that she was a loving mother and that she never showed any signs of believing demons were out to get her or their children. This story would change though, and it started to change after he realized they were not going to easily release his daughter. Did he change up his story to help free his daughter, whether it be true or false? It sounds like it. Barton had claimed for days that his wife was completely sane, but now he was telling a completely different story. He would go on to tell authorities that his wife had been completely sane until she started reading a book. He said the name of this book, this new book she got into, was supposedly called Blind Devotion. Remember at the beginning when I mentioned her picking up a new book? This is that book. This book was said to be about a woman in Michigan, where Lolita and Barton came from, and this woman had 4 children, just like them. Barton said that Lolita was absolutely undoubtedly convinced the book was about her life. Barton would go on to say that Lolita started slowly losing her sanity, and that he first really took notice to it when she was smoking a cigarette in bed and looked over at him and said that she had a confession, that spirits were going to kill her and turn her children over to people that were going to enslave them, that an evil spirit was creeping on them and just waiting to do so. Lolita would even go on to tell him that she blamed herself for her cousin's death, a death, like I said before, that was said to have happened naturally. Well, Barton convinced Lolita to see a psychiatrist. She did, and afterwards basically acted like she had this huge breakthrough and was doing better. And then within no time, she started talking about the book again and how she was seeing visions in her head of her children being tortured by demons. She would go on to see another psychiatrist. This psychiatrist would kind of just shrug it off and say that it wasn't that severe and that she could be cured, that it was nothing really to worry about. Barton said he's still worried though, and one psychiatrist he spoke to would even verify that not long before the murders happened, that Barton made it known he was frightened that Lolita was really going to go off the deep end soon. When I first started diving into this case, I was like, okay, well, obviously Barton is saying all this because, you know, he wants to back up his daughter, because his daughter was saying that her mother was saying all of these things the day of the murders. But the fact that a psychiatrist came forward and kind of backed all this up, I guess he wasn't lying. Apparently, there was even an incident where she asked him where she could get some chloroform from, because she wanted to pour it on the faces of their children so they wouldn't feel as much pain when the demons came to get them. One friend of the family's did come forward though and kind of backed this claim up. He said that he had spoken to Lolita not long before the murders and that she asked him the same question, where to get some chloroform. And she also asked him where the best place to hit someone in the head was, a place to, you know, take them out faster. So it was looking like maybe Lolita had been going through some severe psychological issues. Maybe Barton didn't want to give up that information at first due to tarnishing his wife's image even more. Maybe he didn't want to believe that she had these issues going on and she actually believed the things that she had been telling him. Maybe he possibly felt some sort of guilt because he saw signs and believed she would have never been capable of doing such a thing. Either way though, he would lawyer up on the same day of April 6th. He hired an attorney who released their first statement. Their attorney said, and I quote, "We condemn the relentless hours of questioning this child has been put through. The United States Supreme Court has held time and again that relentless hours of questioning, even on an adult, constitute one form of third degree. It is evident that certain police officers were more anxious to try to prove their theory of the case rather than to determine the real truth." After speaking to this attorney he had just hired, they decided it was time to move on to a different doctor. They were done with Dr. DeRiver. Barton hired psychiatrist Samuel M. Marcus, and their attorney would release another statement saying, "It is unfortunate that up to the present time, highly prejudicial statements and material have been circulated about the case prior to the defense's opportunity to hire a psychiatrist for a scientific and competent investigation of the girl's mental condition and all of the facts." From a study of the preliminary report by Dr. Marcus, There are important elements of physical and mental shock to be considered before an adequate appraisal of the girl's reactions can be evaluated. Thus far, the investigation tends to disclose that Chloe is probably a normal child and has had a normal family life, and that the statements heretofore given out by police were based on a hurried and inadequate study. By this statement, you can easily tell that that was a jab at the prior psychiatrist working with them, Dr. DeRiver. They were throwing a bit of like 1940s shade for sure. Newspapers at the time were all over the place. It was a messy case, to say the least. There was just so much happening in such a small amount of time that they really couldn't keep up. Dr. DeRiver would then come back with his own statement in regards to what was said about him, and he was quoted saying, "Any information that was given out about the mental or physical condition of Chloe Davis was given by full permission of police officials. My opinion was based on close observation and study of the girl over a period of approximately 6 hours on 2 occasions. I did not reveal in any way my findings that would be submitted in my confidential reports to the police. As a public official, any statement I gave to the press was with the full permission of the police department. She was treated with the utmost consideration. We never lost sight of the fact that she was a juvenile. No one asked any leading questions. She was allowed to tell her story in her own way." At the end of each interview, the child seemed to be fresher than most of those who were questioning her. She really amazed all of us by her alertness. Even though he had released that statement, it was kind of too late because the public had developed their extreme sympathy for Chloe Davis, and people, for the most part, highly criticized how the authorities questioned her and how they pinned her as this vengeful child who had the ability to murder 4 of her family members and feel nothing in response to it. The funerals for Lolita, Daphne, Deborah, and Mark was held on Friday, April 12th of 1940. This is a newspaper clipping from the Los Angeles Times, and you can clearly see poor Barton on the far bottom left corner just sobbing. It sends chills down your spine. The 4 of them are buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, California. The LAPD at this time were charging Chloe Davis with 2 counts of assault with intent to commit great bodily harm. A coroner's jury, though, ruled that it was Chloe's mother who had killed her 3 children and then took her own life, that Chloe was not to blame for any of it. The day before the final decision would be made in regards to what happens to Chloe Davis, Barton's attorney released one final statement saying, "We cannot condemn enough the publication of Dr. DeRiver's report because it is not a fair appraisal of the girl's mind. We believe that the examination made by Dr. DeRiver was a most vicious attack. We do not believe that the interest and welfare of the child were considered at the time the police psychiatrist made his examination on Chloe." It was in front of the judge, Judge Fox, where she was retelling her story, where Chloe would show her first bit of sadness since the very beginning. Before, she seemed to feel nothing at all, but now she had actually shed some tears. Although she never cried before, I do have to say that Chloe was quoted saying on April 7th, "I can't cry. They don't believe me, but I can't cry. I cry inside all the time. Since this awful thing happened, I have been crying inside all the time." On April 24th, Chloe Dibble Davis would be a ward of the court for a year, but she was exonerated of any charges and she was released. She went home with her father that same day. They basically claimed that Lolita Davis was responsible for everything, and that if Chloe partook in any of it, it was because she was being controlled by her mother, and that she was always taught to do what either her parents said to do. They also said that the reasoning for her being so stoic was because she was obviously in shock and under a lot of mental stress, that it would probably take a long time to recover. Dr. DeRiver had been a very respected psychiatrist that worked with the LAPD. He even helped years later with the Black Dahlia case, but for this time after this case, people really looked down on him for how he handled everything with Chloe. This would not be the last time Dr. DeRiver, though, had anything to say in regards to the child, because he would even go on to use her as one of his many case studies in his book, The Sexual Criminal, which I probably won't be reading because it goes for a whopping $92.21 on Amazon for hardcover and $793.25 for paperback. Anyways, the description of this book, it states it was first published in 1949, which was 9 years after the case, as a criminology, sexology textbook for law enforcement personnel. The sexual criminal methodically and clinically examines the bizarre and illicit sexual behaviors of Los Angeles in the 1930s and 40s. A fascinating glimpse at the seedy underbelly of a city littered with innumerable true life noir characters. Yes, an 11-year-old would be featured in this book because, like I said, Dr. DeRiver believed that Chloe had this attraction to her father, and that is why she wanted her mother, mostly her mother, gone. As for Chloe, very little information can be found about the rest of her life after what happened. In her brain, though, everything was normal. She did not really see any intensity for the situation. As for how she handled it in later years, once her brain developed more, we do not really know. Only ones closest to her would have known that. According to findagrave.com, she did go on to marry 3 times during her life, once in 1950, once in 1962, and again in 1986. She would also go on to have 3 sons, Gary, Todd, and John. She went on to own and operate a glass studio called The Bevelry. She was a member of the All Souls Unitarian Church, the Athenaeum Turner's Orchestra, and the Butler University Symphony. She was a very accomplished artist in her area. She played violin professionally, and she even fenced. It is believed that as she got older, she really tried to separate herself from what happened when she was 11 years old. She went on to live a pretty normal life. From my research as a whole, people who have really dove into this case or kept up with it through the years really commend Chloe and look at her as somewhat of an inspiration, that she faced this huge loss in life, lived through something catastrophic, became the main character of a real-life horror story, and didn't let it affect her in a way where she spiraled downhill years later. It is obvious that her mother was suffering greatly from mental health issues that were misunderstood at the time, and because of that, the outcome was devastating. Lolita's mental state had collapsed, and the family did live comfortably, but they definitely didn't have the money to send her away for serious psychiatric help. And also, the way people back then with these sort of mental troubles were treated was horribly. So she wouldn't have even received proper help. I mean, most people today are not even treated properly for their mental health issues, and this was the 1940s. There's so many aspects to take into consideration with this case, but bottom line is that this incident, it should have never happened. From what